Okay, we're going to pick up the story then again. So we've left things in a very unstable situation. We've got these rationalist insights which are predicated on the power of reason and the desire for sound, reliable knowledge of the world. We've got the empiricist insights, which acknowledges the role of the senses and the dubitability of everything that we know. And then we've got this bloody German, Immanuel Kant, who comes along. As I said, Hume awakened him from his slumber. And Kant tries to find an accommodation between these two perspectives. Kant's not easy to read. Some people love his writing, some people don't like his writing. I'm putting me firmly in the camp of those who don't like his writing, but there you go. But his legacy is really, really complex, and we're not going to attempt to do justice to Kant here. Nobody does. His writing was sufficiently sophisticated on these issues that it can be used in the service of very many kinds of arguments which are at the heart of cognitive science. One thing Kant did was he pointed out that in order to make use of your experience, in order for experience, sensory experience, lived experience to be of any use whatsoever, there's some stuff that has to be in place beforehand, what he calls synthetic a prioris. These are things like the notion of causality and the notion of space and of time. You never encounter space. Space is the means by which you encounter other things. You don't encounter time. Time is the means by which something arises or goes away. Kant was well appraised of Newton's mechanical universe, his clockwork universe. This, to Kant, really was what natural law was about, and his physics, as it were, was a deterministic physics that would have fitted well with Newton. But he recognized that that won't do to provide an account of the living, of the actions of the living. Indeed, it seems that Kant despaired of ever adequately accounting for the volitional, intentional actions of the living. Kant realized that we are finite beings, that we may never know. I think I'm going to agree with him here. That there's an awful lot that we ought to recognize our limits, and that there may be some forms of understanding which are simply beyond us. His pessimism with respect to understanding the intentional activities of the living, combined with his physics, which was a deterministic Newtonian kind of physics, would seem to rule out a science of psychology. That's one way of reading Kant. Sorry, can't do any psychology at home. Another way is to take him as the entire justification for your psychological agenda, which is also what's done. That's why I say he doesn't have a single legacy. But in this complicated legacy, what the main themes that seem to recur are these of a transcendental subject. That is, you're never going to find a mind. Your experience is you have epistemological privilege. Your mind is secret, hidden, unobservable, never to be observed. And that subject is in touch with the world through the mediation of the senses. So the subject has no direct knowledge of the world, no direct knowledge of anything. You have no knowledge of the world as it is. The world as it appears to you is a form of a construct which arises through your interaction based on your capacity for acting and sensing in the world. You come to know the world in human terms. If you're going to use this as a justification for doing psychology, which is not, of course, what Kant would have done, but then you end up with something like a mind or a cognitive system that needs to be unpacked, that we can never see, but we're going to infer from button presses, reaction times, and God knows what. That's psychology the contemporary scientific psychology is thoroughly Kantian in this regard. Kant's metaphysical view, which is that the world that you encounter on human terms, is astonishingly powerful. I think nobody can get around this. We'll meet more modern incarnations of this, especially if any of you take my topics module in the second semester. We're used to thinking of ourselves as distinct from the world. Most of our psychological science suggests we're distinct from the world. That's not really Kant's view. Kant's view is that the world that you encounter a human world, an ant encounters an ant world, a goldfish encounters a goldfish world. Of course, because it could not be any other way. You can never know things as they are in themselves. This is to be treated with caution. So he sets up a big theater of explanation, which is difficult for us to deal with. And we're still dealing with this today. Some people just try and go around Kant. Some people try to barge through Kant. But nobody can really simply ignore Kant completely. We have a whole variety. The most well-populated areas in scientific psychology are representational approaches, in which a transcendental subject is in contact with a transcendental world through the medium of representations. This is the standard story that you will meet that is assumed in most scientific psychology. But it's really important that you see that it's an assumption. There's one way of coming at things, and it leaves lots of other questions unaddressed, and that nobody is bound to be committed to it. In particular, this kind of approach tends to lead to a single subject-object divide, a single distinction between subject and world. This is the view that informs our everyday language of speaking about ourselves. It's not going anywhere, even as we point to its limitations. It is, however, built upon various questionable philosophical assumptions. And the answer is not that we had the wrong philosophers. The point is that if you assume a single fixed subject-object divide, you're committing yourself in ways that you ought to be aware of. And that prohibits you from looking at things in some other ways. Non-representational approaches are not very well dealt with within most contemporary scientific frameworks. They include, for example, the phenomenological tradition, which is the philosophical tradition, Western philosophical tradition, that has sought to make experience an object of study. Now, if you think of experience as being, by definition, subjective, you've got a problem. You've got a subject-object problem right here. The main figures here would be Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Hans Jonas, Sartre. They all differ. There's lots of different ways you can come at this. Some of them are absolutely hostile to science because of its objectivity aspirations. Some of them are much less so. Merleau-Ponty is, for example, not at all hostile to science. And there's a great deal of insight in contemporary scientific work coming from these traditions. Typically, though, the notion of a single fixed divide between subject and object is at least negotiable here. Right. We're not here to do philosophy of mind, but we just needed to set the stage so that you know who the main players are, what the main directions are, what are the main landscapes. What we're trying to get to is to figure out where psychology came from. Psychology as a science is very, very young. It's only been around since the end of the 19th century. And the end of the 19th century was a really heady time in science. The scientific method was paying off in spades. The Industrial Revolution had happened. The entire population had been turned into a workforce. There hadn't previously a workforce, there was just people. Now there was a workforce, and they went to work in factories, and there was products being made. There was an entire economy built on manufacturing. And everywhere the scientific method was applied, it seemed there were immediate technological paybacks. So we had not only the steam engine, and we had we had electricity. Around this time, the atomic theory is starting to come into focus. We've got the Maxwell's laws for electromagnetism. We've got all kinds of startling discoveries that are paying off in spades. For the second half of the 19th century, we also have, for the first time, a scientific biology that allows us to consider ourselves as continuous with the rest of creation. It's only 150 years ago. We haven't been doing this long at all. There's no surprise if we're getting a few things wrong at this stage. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, we were separate from the rest of creation. You couldn't argue in public that we weren't. You got into trouble. You were locked up or hanged. It's very important to realize how our ideas have been shaped by the culture in which they grew and how those are tied to specific European historical developments as we're talking about them in a European scientific context. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we've got these three: Descartes, Newton, Kant. I've left out Hume, put Hume in there. We've got the cogito, which is a problem for us because it lands us with this question of indubitability that seems to demand that we be separate from the world that we can't make sense of. We've got Newton providing us with a deterministic universe in which our volitional actions can play no role. We've got Kant's trying to figure this stuff out, but ending up with this view of a transcendental subject and a transcendental world, so that you start to lose all touch with reality. Then, 19th century, we've got all this progress in physics and chemistry and biology, and it's only at this point that we can start to turn the scientific method on ourselves and to ask, well, it's worked so well for figuring out how to turn lead into gold, well, whatever the Industrial Revolution was about, I forget. Why could we not study things ourselves? So I'm going to give you, here's a nice historical overview, and I put myself in there not because I count here, but to show you just how recent all this is. That's my actual extent of life. There's Kant, there's Newton, there's Galileo, there's Martin Luther. My God, it's only a couple of days ago. So we really haven't been doing this long. The birth of science, these are the psychologists in yellow. The birth of scientific psychology is here in the middle of the 19th century. Prior to that, you couldn't talk of minds as being generated in physiology. You couldn't take a biological approach to our being because that was to turn us into animals. And you got into trouble with the authorities if you did. Prior to here, 50 years earlier, around here, Mary Shelley was writing her novel Frankenstein, based on what was becoming clear that the role of electricity in the body was to animate it. She did so in self-imposed exile. Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley were in exile in Switzerland because they couldn't go home, because you couldn't articulate these ideas. Now, if that's the case here, then you cannot ignore the role of these theological insights in forming the foundational questions that we're still grappling with in the philosophy of mind. You just can't extricate them. Descartes, strong Catholic. Kant, very committed Lutheran. Hume, closet atheist. I don't know too much about Locke's religious views. Spinoza, we haven't talked about Spinoza, gave us a wonderful alternative. That's still think we haven't worked through, but he was an excommunicated Jew. Newton, of course, was totally crazy. He was an alchemist into all sorts of weird stuff and a very unpleasant character to boot. But if we go back here to Luther, why have I put Luther in there? And the previous century, where we get to talk about representation, really everything that was interesting was going on in the previous century with the Renaissance and the development of linear perspective. I put Luther in there because this is the time of the Protestant Reformation, and this is the time at which the notion of the generalized understanding of individuals as entirely autonomous and responsible for all their actions on their own and discrete and self-contained comes into focus for the first time. Before then, you were kind of responsible for what you did, but nobody really cared about such matters. You were one of a chosen people, or you were sort of a good character. But it's only around here, with the Protestant Reformation, that moral responsibility for everything is placed on the shoulders of the individual. So now we have not only political questions, we've got theological, moral questions, all mixed up with how we come at the notion of the person. And it's only in that sort of ground that this notion of the cogito could grow at all. And it's really not very much time. So I have to put this in here just to say that, Lordy, if cognitive science comes with a lot of questions, we haven't been doing this for very long. Right? So, when you go set off and you've got your scientific method and you're going to turn it on yourself, whatever that means, what is psychology a science of? So I'm going to ask you, what psychology is science of? Given that you're not going to be allowed to use the word mind here, okay? Because that would assume that we knew what minds were in the first place. We don't. So what psychology is science of? It didn't set out to be a science of mind. Behavior. And it's two-pronged, it's schizophrenic. Experience. What it is, what it feels like. People want to know, why do they feel this? Why do colors look one way? Do colors look the same to you as they do to me? I don't know. What were my motives for my behavior? What did I intend to get done? If you're going to include memory in there, for example, that's not a behavior, right? And so it's experience. Experience and behavior were the two poles that psychology set out to examine. And we've noted that this is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It looks like an innocent word. It's not an innocent word. Experience is probably the best way of referring to the indubitability of the lived present for an individual present. And we're extremely good at using it in conversation and talking about our experience. I can experience the redness of that chair right now. How about it? Can everyone experience the redness of a chair just for a little bit? Oh, reddening. Right. So we're quite good at talking about experience. Behavior is what we see. But we'll see, well, that's difficult as well. So this is the twin goals that this science, nascent science, set out to address. And there were some important developments. So it was already known that those nerves were actually electrical fibers that transmitted electricity at about 30 meters per second from about 1850 there. And that you could relate physical quantities to sensations. This is the business of psychophysics, which we'll look at in just a minute. That had become clear. By 1879, it was possible to establish an experimental psychological lab in Leipzig. That's the same year that the Virgin Mary appeared in Knock in County Sligo. So, while they were, I don't know, it was more rational. And the first textbook, the really first strong, big textbook in psychology is 1890, William James, The Principles of Psychology. We'll start with William James. He's kind of everyone's favorite psychologist. No matter what flavor of psychology you belong to, everyone wants to have William James as their founder. His brother Henry James is a novelist, of course, a very famous novelist. And at least one of James's notions has had more effect in novels than it has had in science. That's the notion of a stream of consciousness. This is a literary conceit, the notion of a stream of consciousness. It's not something we know how to address scientifically. But he says, consciousness doesn't appear to itself chopped up in bits, it flows. It's a very Heraclitean vision here. Heraclitus was the guy who's all about flow and change. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it's most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness, or of subjective life. James managed to articulate a complex set of beliefs around that was compatible with the notion of something like a cogito, that addressed the notion of lived experience. But it's a literary conceit. It doesn't articulate an object of scientific study. And it's very much in the Parmenidean camp, whereas all the science has been done, in the Heraclitean camp, where all the science has been done in the Parmenidean camp. We find this idea of the stream of consciousness really taking off in the works of people like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or Dostoevsky. I read Crime and Punishment. I walked around for a week afterwards, convinced I killed an old woman with an axe, because you get inside their heads. You really do get inside their heads. If you read Ulysses, it's all about being inside the heads of the characters, and although he goes odd places with it. As well as the principles of psychology, James also wrote this rather interesting book on varieties of religious experience. He was the first one. He wasn't asking about gods, saints, the questionable cosmological decisions taken by one religious tradition over another. He wanted to know, what's it feel like to be religious? What's it feel like to commune with God? What does it feel like to be a nun? What's it like to be a mystic? He wanted to know what the experience was in various religious traditions. And he was influenced in many parts by Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, the kind of crossovers that we're going to encounter again and again. And perhaps because of all this, He was one of an American school which we tend to lump together. John Dewey and Charles Peirce and William James were formed the American pragmatists. In William James's case, it's just really an idea of trying to do work that's going to be some bloody use to somebody. Right? He just wasn't into mere metaphysics or anything like that. So while you can see William James has been seminal in the development of the notion of a description of consciousness, and in very many respects the topics that psychology deals with through his textbook writing, he's also the origin of this kind of self-help tradition in popular psychology, which is the idea that whatever you come to understand should help you to be the better you, or should alleviate suffering, or to have a more easy existence in this horror before your death, or whatever is going on there. This is interesting because we don't have self-help physicists. If you listen to the radio and they're interviewing a psychologist, inevitably when the psychologist comes on, they talk in a breathy voice. Chemists don't feel obliged to talk in a breathy voice because they're just talking about stuff. But psychologists always have to. Because people believe that that's what psychologists are. That's the role of a priest. That's what a priest is. Right, so we got this weird dual tasking again. We want to be part of the science community, but we also want to help you feel better about yourself. William James is at the root of all of this. So how do you do, if you set yourself these impossible goals of meddling where otherwise priests are involved and you want to apply the scientific method, how do you go about that? Well, the answer is you throw everything at it as you got. Right, so there's a lot of armchair thinking going on, and there still happens today. I think Noam Chomsky's generative grammar is the greatest example of influential theory cooked up in an armchair, without reference to any data. We mentioned Fechner there, who showed that measurable physical quantities could be related in a systematic way to perceived qualities. That was important, because that suggested you could do a science here, at least of something to do with the senses. And that gives this word psychophysics, which I can never see without thinking psycho-killer. I'm not sure why. We'll look at psychophysics in a minute, because it really, the psychophysics is still with us today, and it's one of the earliest of these. It's about the only part of psychology that has persisted in unbroken tradition up to the present day, and yet it is bizarre at its heart. I love it. Experimental psychology can be done in all kinds of ways. Around the end of the 19th century, there was a big interest in mesmerism, or what we now call hypnosis, and this was used partially in a sort of a spectacular way, but also to inquire about altered states of consciousness, about volition, free will, those kinds of things. And there's a lot of good work done in hypnosis today. I've left out the whole of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis here, which never quite made it to the scientific stage, which gave us these very imaginative stories, and Freud himself was convinced that his work was pioneering, but that it wasn't yet science, but it would imminently become science, but it didn't. It became lots of other things, but it never quite crossed over into the scientific mainstream. And then, you've all heard of it, the mortal sin of introspection. You want to know how minds work. Well, ask yourself. So what are you experiencing right now? I want you to look deep into your soul. Cool, I feel your hunger. Let's start with maybe the most promising of these, the psychophysics. This is the one that represents the unbroken tradition. Many of you have any experience at all with psychophysics? Nope. I hope we have sound. Because I've got to illustrate a little bit. What's important here is that it was discovered that things that physicists measured could be related in a principled fashion to subjective experience, to qualities perceived, the redness of red, or the depth of a tone, or something like that. In the example I'm going to use here is from the domain of sound. Now, usually this is all done seeing. Seeing seems to have taken the lion's share of work, but I think I'm just going to use this example because I have it prepared. We can measure the frequency of vibration of the air. That's a physical measurement. Everyone agrees we know how to, if something's vibrating 100 times a second, we can count that. It's grand, we can count it. That's the frequency was measured in a unit called hertz. We also know that if you vary the frequency, the sound changes. And the sound change is what we call pitch. So we speak of sounds which are higher or sounds which are lower. Let's have a listen and see if we can hear this. I don't know if this is going to work. Okay, that's 100 hertz. Now if we double that and make it 200 hertz, everybody agree that went up? It's funny, there's no necessary, I'm pointing up. We're speaking of up. It's a bit of a mystery why we tend, and we could have said left and right or north and south or something, but anyway, we'll stick with that. So that went up. So if I go to 300 hertz, will it go up again? First of all, what was the relationship between those two tones? Anybody, any musicians? Hmm?
Full step.
Full step?
It was sharp.
Sharper. I'm going to do them again, okay? Here's the first one. Here's the second one. It's an octave. It's one octave higher. So if we go to 300, do we get another octave? No, we don't. It's a fifth. If we go to 400, now we've got to turn that down a little bit. So yeah, so from here to here was one octave, from here to here was another octave. So it looks like doubling the frequency leads to an even space in the perceived pitch space, as it were. So we're trying to map from a physical space of of frequency, which we can measure, to what we hear and encounter as meaningful. So there's a real sense in which these are, the relationship of this to this is very similar to the relationship of this to this. If we go to 800, 1600. So, right? It looks like we've uncovered a very simple relationship. As you work on this more and more, you find it's not quite that simple. Here's the relationship between frequency, here shown on a log scale, and pitch. We need a different unit if we're talking about what people perceive. So where we measure frequency in hertz, we measure pitch in something called mels. And there's a large stretch over which this relationship is roughly a straight line. That's the scale, the area of frequencies in which when you double the frequency, you get an octave higher. But it's not always the case, particularly for low tones, that goes away. It's more complicated than it met. And you find this kind of relationship out by doing things like getting people to say, when does something sound like something else? When does something noticeably different? What kind of differences can you make? What discriminations can you make? If I give you two stimuli, I can ask you to adjust one so it sounds like twice the other. That'll be like an octave. So there's a kind of a doubling. And you can do this, you can do these general kinds of questions in very many domains. But notice, I can measure only one end of this. I can only measure frequency. The way to get at pitch is to ask you, and there's no short circuit. There's no other way to get at this. That's the psychophysics bit. This is the physics, and that's the psycho bit. Yeah. Now we can do that for sound. We just looked at the relationship between frequency and pitch. Staying in the sound domain, I can vary the amplitude, the physical energy of a signal, and you'll tell me it got louder. I can't measure loudness. There is no measurement you can do for loudness. I can measure intensity or amplitude, and I can relate it to loudness. I can measure luminosity in terms of number of photons falling on a unit area in a given time. What I can't measure is brightness. You can tell me whether it's bright, whether it's got bright, whether the brightness has doubled, halved, or whatever. And we can do this for lots of things. We don't have to do it with these apparently simple dimensions. So for example, we could take a glass of wine and look at the chemical composition of the glass of wine. We'd find very many chemicals in there, a rich, heady mixture, and that is related somehow to taste. But the only way I can find out about taste is by asking you. I can't measure, I can measure all the chemicals. After a while, if I've done this a lot, I might be able to make the inference from the presence of chemicals to certain statements about taste. In fact, you're probably well aware, if you do this in the domain of wine, it's going to be unstable. The kind of vocabulary, if you do a wine tasting course with the Irish Times and you come back and you go, yes, cherries and beetroots and leather and notes of spring and jockstrap and what have you. It's notoriously unstable. It depends who you learned it off. If you're with a bunch of people, you can develop a sort of vocabulary that's stable for you guys, but it's not going to travel very well. So that's a poor, perhaps, worked example of psychophysics. We can do this in the domain of touch, pressure versus perceived pressure. As long as we're talking about something we can measure on the one hand and something you can report on, we can do psychophysics. So that makes it look really sciencey, but it's kind of perplexing. Because as we're doing our good science here and coming up with these lines, which are reproducible, which we can do in different labs, we can verify that different people do it, we can do this, compare populations, we've got well-established methods, we can do this very well. What's the mapping between? We're mapping between two domains, only one of which we can measure. And that's a problem. If science is about measurement, unless you regard this as a mapping between one form of measurement and another form of measurement. But the second form of measurement is your verbal report, which is a peculiar form of measurement. I can measure the sound on either side of a wall, for example, and what the wall will do will low-pass filter the sound. So it comes out sounding like that. And I can measure it on both sides, and I can say, well, the effect of the wall is such and such, but I'm doing the same kind of measurement on both sides. Here, on one side, I've got a standard, uncontroversial physical measurement. On the other side, I have this weird notion of your report. It's bizarre. So we mentioned psychophysics, experiments are unbounded. To this day, there's no limit on your creativity in coming up with various kinds of context-bound behavioral experiments. We'll be looking at that throughout this course, but then there's the bugaboo of introspection. You've all heard this. It was a formal method used, among other things, in Wilhelm Wundt's lab, and it came in for an awful lot of criticism, because despite the fact that the introspection was not simply doing what I did, tell me, look inside yourself and tell me what you're feeling. The form in which the introspective method was applied in various labs was worked out, standardized, methodically, and you could probably learn something with it, but the results weren't stable. A bit like the wine tasting, as it moved around from lab to lab, the results changed, and so it came in for massive criticism. But here's not so much of a well-kept secret. We all introspect. If I tell you that actually you're a zombie, there's no lived experience in your part, I'm a solipsist. I'm the only one who perceives the world. You're actually just a machine. You don't believe me. Because you can refer to your own experience. I'm telling you complete and utter nonsense. Whatever story we're going to come up with is going to have to be alignable with your experience of yourself and world. So we all, to that extent, never get away from introspection. We're not using it as a scientific method, though. So everyone laughed and was familiar with what I was saying when I said introspection was a kind of a mortal sin, because this is a story that we tell psychology students all the time, and it's a bit bullshit. We say that at the start of psychology there was a methodological cornucopia, everything that included introspection, but introspection was a really, really bad thing. So we got all sciencey on this, and we put on white coats and became behaviorists, so that we measured everything, and there was no appeal to ghostful mental entities. And then that was a bit soulless, so then in the middle of the 20th century along came the mind as a computer that processes information, what we're going to call cognitivism, and that sort of saved us until nowadays people are talking about the body for some reason. It's a bit more complicated than that. There's a sort of a map of psychology. It's vastly more complicated than that as well. Behaviorism was undeniably a very important school of psychology, not restricted to one part of the world. There were behaviorist approaches in America, in Europe, and Russia. The most famous person was probably Skinner here, but John Watson, Ivan Pavlov were probably household names. In many respects, what they shared was an attempt to be a bit more hard-nosed. So scientists are finding it difficult to shoehorn psychology, the emerging discipline of psychology, into the other sciences. It's 2016, they're still having that difficulty. Okay? That difficulty has not gone away. There were various approaches taken here, which in many respects abandoned one of the two goals with which psychology had been set up. They wanted to come up with something which was adequate for explaining behavior, but they weren't particularly interested in illuminating consciousness. This has in part to do with what was going on in philosophy and mathematics, the rise of logical positivism, there's a variety of reasons. And behaviorism itself comes in very many varieties. What they kind of have in common is an attempt to just make this a little bit simpler. Perhaps brains, perhaps we'd have to rely on brains, They differed a lot in this respect. The experiments done in a behaviorist context were very often done on animals rather than humans. So here we have the business of trying to understand ourselves as continuous with the rest of creation, which is a kind of a new idea. And so changing behaviors, or the acquisition and modification of behaviors, was a principal theme here. In Skinner's lab, he used a method known as operant conditioning. Many of you have heard of operant conditioning? Some of you? No? It's a very, very simple idea. You burn yourself, don't do that again. Right? So your behavior is shaped by its consequences. Things that lead to pleasant consequences are going to be reinforced and you're more likely to produce those behaviors next time. Things that hurt you or are negatively valenced are behaviors that you're less likely to do in the end. And we're going to illustrate this with his famous pigeons. They were kept in little boxes, these pigeons, and they were kept at 2/3 of their normal weight. Don't forget that detail. These are starving. They're highly motivated birds who are starving, and they're individualized, kept in little individual boxes. And then they were fed at unpredictable times. So they're put on a random feeding schedule. Just now and again, a pellet just drops from nowhere. And what happens is really rather remarkable. The pigeons display weird stereotype behaviors, but you wouldn't be able to predict which stereotype behaviors an individual pigeon is going to generate. So one bird was conditioned to turn counterclockwise. Another repeatedly thrust its head into the upper corners of the cage. Two birds developed a pendulum motion of the head, and so on. And there's more stuff in the readings about this. These became known as the superstitious pigeons because it looked like they were trying... If you stand back and look at these pigeons, it looked like they were little reasoners who were going, holy cow, I'm starving. I got some grub. What was I doing that made that grub happen? They seem to think they're in control of things. So whatever it was they did before, they try again. Of course it doesn't work because it's not actually effective. But just like little humans, they ignore the misses and keep doing it. And sooner or later, a pellet arrives and they go, gotcha! Anyone who's ever gambled knows what this is like. Right? This is the basis for most forms of religious explanation. If you have a wacky theory and you just try it often enough and the predicted consequences ultimately come to pass, my God, is that theory now safe? Right? Confirmation bias, we call it in another context. So that's what it looks like. But of course, I'm standing back here, I'm looking at these pigeons and attributing to them all kinds of inner lives, reasoning processes, biases, rationality, which seems inappropriate in a pigeon case. I think. Skinner has a bit of a bad name. Behaviorism, of course, became a term of abuse in some quarters. Behaviorism never went away. Behavior psychologists are still trained, and they make more money than all the cognitive psychologists because they're working for the supermarkets and the banks. They're working for the advertising agencies, and they're working for the web companies, and they're shaping your behavior all the time, because what these processes, these experimental procedures are great for doing is for modifying behavior and getting people to do what you want them to do. I'm going to say another redeeming word, though, for Skinner, as opposed to Pavlov and Watson. Skinner was very acutely aware of the fact that all behaviors are inextricably tied to specific contexts. The modern habit of the cognitive psychologist of taking people out of their lives and putting them in a white room and asking them to click buttons and respond and so on would be anathema to Skinner. And in that, he's very relevant. I mean, the relevance of context and the inextricable importance of context to understanding any behavior is very much a contemporary theme in cognitive science. Then we got Ivan Pavlov. Looks a bit like Spike Milligan, actually, doesn't it? Who here has not heard of Pavlov? Has everyone heard of Pavlov? You know, he makes dogs drool, right? He's the guy that makes dogs drool. What's going on with the making the dogs drool thing? Well, you've got a dog who initially responds to the presence of food by salivating. And this dog just ignores bells because they're just not relevant. They're not part of dog world. And then you repeatedly pair the effective stimulus, the food, with this weird thing, the bell, the sound of the bell. And then you do this sufficiently often, and then comes the experimental crucis, the point at which the whole purpose is revealed. You don't present the food, but you do ring the bell, and the dog salivates. And what do you got? Symbolization. This means effectively the meaning of the food has been transferred onto something which bears no relation to the food. Looks like the origin of symbolic learning. Huge. You get a Nobel Prize for it. There's Mr. Pavlov in his lab with one of his dogs. He did get the Nobel Prize for this. I'm going to let Heinz von Förster tell the next story.
Fascinating experiments to establish the intelligence of animals. I think the most beautiful thing is the Pavlov studies to getting the conditioned reflexing going. Yeah? He had a dog, putting a dog on a table, and there was an assistant in a white coat. The assistant showed the dog a piece of meat, and when the dog looked at it, of course, he was looking forward, he salivated, a lot of saliva was coming up, and then the assistant rang a bell. Okay, very good, they do this 10 times, and then the assistant enters the room, rings the bell, and the dog salivates. This was for dog, the proof of conditional reflex. The dog can transfer the ringing of the bell to the meat without
the meat to the bell.
showing the meat. An act of symbolization. Mm-hmm. And of course, he got for that the Nobel Prize. A Polish experimental psychologist said Pavlov wrote his experimental conditions so well in his lab books that I can repeat his experiments exactly as he carried them out. So Konowski did exactly the experiment. The lab assistant is the same white coat, the dog at the table next to the window, a bell standing next to the table, assistant going with the meat, with the bell, meat and bell. And now comes the experimental crucis, where no meat is shown, only the bell is around. Konowski took the clapper out of the bell without the assistant knowing that. So assistant goes in, grabs the bell, no sound is coming out, but the dog salivates. So Konowski concluded the ringing of the bell was a stimulus for Pavlov, for the dog.
Not for the dog.
But unfortunately, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for that.
No.
So Konowski did this work on his shoestring, but it's a brilliant critique of Pavlov's original work. Heinz von Förster's point is a very serious point. The bell was a stimulus for Pavlov because Pavlov had decided that this was the way to carve up the flow of experience. This was the relevant bit that you would need to provide a causal account of the salivation. The dog never got the memo. The dog was taken from its cage. There's the assistant, there's the bench, at a specific angle to the window. All of this happened. The bell was just one more element in all that sound. There's so much going on in the context that it was the pre-theoretical assumption by Pavlov that it was going to be the sound, was going to be the thing. Because he was viewing the dog as some kind of an automaton, something that you put inputs to and you get outputs from. It's a beautiful point. So I want you to take that as von Förster is a beautiful guy, but his argument here is very, very serious. And it's a serious critique of the notion of stimulus and response in any context. If you say something is a stimulus, and there are still psychologists who use that term, who say we expose so-and-so to a stimulus all the time, be very careful. You have to ask yourself, well, to what extent am I assuming that I'm providing input or driving a system, or to what extent am I actually perturbing an endogenously active system, which is going to notice perhaps the perturbation and respond on its own terms to it. These are questions that were still very much with us. Now, as you know, behaviorism around about the 1950s started to get into difficulty. We've got this very mechanistic view of the human spirit. We've got the absolute failure to address anything to do with experience. And so this denies us much of the mental richness that we have. And you probably all know that its theory of learning, while great for shaping animal behaviors, didn't come close to providing an adequate account of human experience and behavior. And language, of course, was the rock upon which all this founded. We'll come back to that later. But do be aware that the behaviors should not be simply dismissed or critiqued en masse. If psychology was set up with studying experience and behavior, you better take behavior seriously. Right? One of the critiques I would have of contemporary psychology is that it doesn't take behavior seriously, that nearly all the models are built on this behavior. It's not much of a behavior, is it? That's a reaction time. If I make the assumption that Pavlov made, what I can observe is a wagging of a finger. So most psychological models these days are founded on finger wagging, which is a precious, anemic behavior. And then something happened in the middle of the 20th century. A lot of things came together. 1945, the von Neumann architecture. This is the basic architecture of what we now call a computer, was established with the central processing unit, with its inputs and its outputs and so on. And with that, the development of formal computer languages to describe the relationship of inputs to outputs. We've got a series of conferences from 46 to 53 called the Macy Conferences, which tried to lay the foundation for what was called the general science of the human mind. And at that stage, it was called cybernetics. The idea underlying cybernetics, the Greek root refers to the steersman on a boat, it's now known more or less as control theory. The idea is, well, what is the relationship between the behavior of a system and the inputs and outputs that it gets? So making that question an awful lot richer. We had the development of a formal mathematical theory of information. Claude Shannon, working in Bell Labs, mathematicized the notion of information in this, what he called a mathematical theory of communication. And interestingly, it was only about 5 years later, because this set the world on fire. About 5 years later, you've got Claude Shannon writing papers saying, hang on, I didn't mean it to go that far. You're taking this all far too beyond the bounds where it was, but the genie was out of the box there. We've got information theory going on. We've got Alan Turing, who's well versed in all these notions, showing us how we might use these kind of concepts in order to deal with the very difficult question of deciding whether something was minded or not. Intelligent, whatever you like. We've got the failure of Skinner's attempt to tackle language in a book called Verbal Behavior, which was given a devastating review by a young academic at the time, Noam Chomsky, who came out with his own theory that placed syntax at the heart of the study of language, and emphasis was built very much on the notion of generativity and creativity, raising concerns that the behaviorist accounts were incapable of dealing with. We've got the birth in 1967 of something called cognitive psychology that attempts to use these various bits and pieces to develop a new kind of scientific psychology. And then 1973 with the birth of the term cognitive science. That's as far as we're going to go today, but this turn, I've called it the cognitive turn there, is extremely important to fix in your heads as a landscape. Somewhere between 1950 and 1970, the entire game changed. And it's changing again. It hasn't stopped changing since then. It's not the case that we were then done, but that would be, given our little historical view, it would be kind of surprising if we reached the end point of this, wouldn't it?